My name is Tom Hyland. I think many of you know me. Been covering Italian wines for 20 years and specifically Barolo for about that amount of time. I'm usually there a couple times a year, but my friend Sandro lives in Piemonte, he lives in Torino, and he, without getting too involved here, he leads tours of journalists things, and he was kind enough to take me around a couple days over the past few years and introduce me to producers and answer a lot of questions. And he is extremely knowledgeable about Barolo, about the subject today. And I thought it would be a perfect webinar for the two of us if we could combine one a foreigner and one a native. So Sandra, anything you want to add before we start?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Tom, and thanks to all people who are attending the webinar. It was a real pleasure, of course, for me to be around Barolo region with you, Tom, and introducing to producers that I know since many years. I lived in Monforte d'Alba for many years, and I live near Turin, but my life is always there around Barolo. I'm there almost on a daily basis. And so what I really like, is when we talk about wine, also talk about and learn and know the people behind the wine and their stories, which I think are very interesting and almost as much as interesting as the technical aspect, even more, because I think one of the elements when you talk about a wine is always the man that make wine. Of course, we talk about soil, microclimate, grape varieties, etc., and levels of acidity or whatever. But the human factor is always, I think, the most involving aspect of the wine business. So of course, Tom Hyland doesn't need any introduction when it comes to Piemonte, because everybody in Piemonte wine world knows Tom very well.
Well, thank you.
And he is a great ambassador for our region.
Thank you. We're going to basically go through. This is going to be Sandro's presentation. I will add a few points here and there, but Sandro has put together a wonderful PowerPoint presentation here, and we're going to be looking at both, if you pardon the expression, the forest and the trees. We're going to be looking not only at specific vintages, and we are looking at every vintage of the 21st century. Even to 2020, I got some information this morning from a producer about the vintage, and we can't tell about the wines yet, but we can make predictions. So we're going to be looking at the specific vintages, but also at trends. And of course, climate change will come up, and we'll look at how that has affected things. And I think, Sandra, you might agree that it's certainly an important part of this discussion, but it's not the only part. And I think some people today are looking at a vintage like 2016, which is so young and so approachable, as being the direct result of climate change. And of course, there's a lot more to it than that. So with that, and one other point is that we may have a lot of questions today. We'll get to them if we have time. We have an hour, we might go 5 minutes over the hour. We have an hour and we have 20 vintages, so we have a lot to cover. So if we don't get to your questions, I think you'll understand why. So anyway, with that, Sandro, why don't you start with your presentation?
Yeah, so exactly like you said, Tom, it's always important to put things in perspective when you talk about a vintage, but considering all the different aspects, as I was saying before, also the human factor, which is one of the elements that combines to the quality and the characteristics of wine. So not only the climate change themselves, they're not enough to explain the whole thing and the whole evolution. So let's start from a wide perspective, and then we'll zoom in on these 20 vintages, and then of course we'll go on the details of every vintage. But let's start from something that was published recently in the second edition of Barolo MGA by Alessandro Masnaghetti and Ogea, which is the reference, the Bible of Barolo, if you want. And just take this image. It shows you the evolution from 1971 to 2017. So we can assume that it's pretty much covering all these 5 decades. The evolution of the times of harvest, the average time of harvest. So he calculated the time of harvest from many different producers, put together with some statistical corrections, of course, because the data are not always exactly comparable, but to a good approximation. And it's very, very easy to see an aspect. This is the long brown line, the vertical line here, is the average of all these 5 decades. So as you can see, up to the 1989, all the vintages were more, or the harvest times were more late. So the blue lines here, the blue dots here, represent a later harvest. The brown ones on the left represent earlier than average. So as you can see, up to 1989, all the harvests were much later than the average of the 50 years. And then starting exactly on 1990, that was the first slightly early vintage. That was followed by a sequence of early or late. And then, as you can see, in the last 2 decades, we have still some oscillation between very early or late. But of course, the whole the picture here shows you very clear evolution. So the harvest times are much earlier on average today. Which are the possible causes? Possible because we don't have a parameter that can say it all. We have to consider different things. First of all, of course, the climate changes, global and regional. Regional, I mean that it's not only about the higher temperature, it's about how the anticyclones work through the year. So when we have that heat compared to other years, past years. So of course, the climatic element, but also some human factors. For example, lower yields per hectare. We do more green harvest. That was not done at all in the 1970s and early 80s. And then it started, of course, with less yields, the harvest time for the vines becomes earlier. But also the way that the yields are obtained, by choosing the kind of buds that will become clusters. Also, another element, old versus new vine disease treatments. In the past, they were using lots of the Bordeaux mix, as they called it, so copper and carbonate and calcium that would cover the leaves and would also be poisonous to the plants for a good part. And so that was kind of a stress, and that slowed down the photosynthesis. The plant would ripen later. Of course, that's also an element that we can explain. Changes in other viticultural practices. For example, we use much less manure now, and the manure that was normally put in the spring would push the production, both the green part and the bunches. Other elements, the choice of clones after those cold and rainy decades, where it was sometimes hard to reach the minimum sugar level to obtain a great wine. After these decades, many people started to plant clones of Nebbiolo that would have more sugar, that would ripen earlier. So after a while, many vineyards were planted with that, and you don't replace a vineyard after 10 years just because there's a weather change, So we still have many vineyards that were planted with clones that were chosen to be early harvest and rich in sugar. Of course,
Sandro, one question. This new planting of clones, are we talking about the 1980s? Are we talking about the 1970s?
Yeah. More 1980s, the choice of clone. For example, the classic clone of the Rosé was took away and substitute with Miquette and Lampia, and then the new clones that are even earlier harvest. Of course, more accurate weather forecast. It means that we are maybe late September, mid-October, early October. There's a couple of days of rain, but then we know that we will have another 2 weeks of sun. We might decide to wait after the rain, but in the past, they didn't know. And so when rain started in October, it was time to harvest, even if the grapes were not perfect, because it was too dangerous to leave them there. Another element, in the past, which sometimes we don't think about it, but in the past, up to the 70s and 80s, almost nobody in the Langhe was only producing grapes and wines. Most of the farms, almost all of them, would have crops, some cows in the stable, other activities, corn, and so they had to attend to different jobs through the year. And sometimes the harvest of Nebbiolo was delayed just because there were things that were more urgent to do, like
Right.
other harvest or other activities. So all these things have to be considered if we want to try to explain these changes. And given the climatic change, which is something that we cannot change the climatic conditions from the vineyards, but we can adapt to these climate changes in many different ways. I'm just telling a few of techniques. To prune later, of course, in the winter pruning, I mean, which will start with delay a little bit the bud break. Prune without leaving too many buds, because with more buds we can adapt the ripening part, and so we can avoid excess production in case of water stress in the summer. Trim less, again, to avoid water stress, so leaving more green part. Don't remove too many leaves around the bunches, so we don't have direct sunlight on the bunches that will burn them. Deploy anti-hail nets. That another element of the climate changes is that we have more extreme storms and ups and downs of temperature. So the hail nets cast a little shadow, and they can delay a little bit the photosynthesis and then the harvest times.
Sandro,
Avoid.
let me ask you a question about these hail nets, because I've seen producers such as
Yep.
Roberto Varzio is very active with using anti-hail nets,
And many
as are
others.
several other, artisan producers. Are these expensive? I just wondered that maybe they're a little bit too pricey for, for the.
Well, of course, you have always to consider it's hard to give one answer for all. It depends on the size of the vineyard, the location. Also consider that not all parts of Barolo have the same possibility of having
Right.
having a hailstorm. So it's always a matter of calculating the pros and cons of that process. One of the pros is that you can delay a little bit the harvest time. Then other things: work the underrow to keep plants hydrated, leave natural grass growth. In the 1970s, the grass from the vineyards were removed completely, totally. Now it's very, very few vineyards that remove that completely. That prevents erosion, that preserves the biodiversity, and maintains the humidity, which can also be a good component for a more balanced ripening process. And of course, not delay the harvest too much, because when the grapes are ready for the sugar, but the acidity has to be kept in consideration. A good example for that, if you agree with me, Tom, is the 2017 hot vintage that in some cases was too hot. Sometimes the wines are kind of over ripened, but we tasted recently some wines that were some Barolos that were absolutely fresh and balanced. And that was due to an accurate choice of the harvest time.
Right. Just one point here I have open today is, get this on the screen, right? The 2017 Rocca di Castiglione from Modero. Now, this is a couple points about that. This is exactly the model for 2017 as to what.
Exactly. And I have something a bit older, 2012 from Cannubi that I will enjoy later with you.
When I tasted that wine, one other thing, I tasted this wine, with somebody here in Chicago, he just said, you can't believe the wine is from 2017, which has been advertised as this hot vintage, but it just shows you that not only is this, the correct winemaking and wine growing and picking the grapes at the right time, but it's also, I think the point we need to make here is that, when you look at certain vintages, again, in 2016, everybody made the first rate wine. And it's in the difficult years like this. So it's not only the producer, but as our friend Alessandro Masnaghetti will repeat again and again, the best vineyards are the best vineyards for a reason. They consistently perform well.
Exactly. That's on average, even if when the vintages are not perfect, they can still give great quality. Yeah.
Yes. So
let's zoom in a little bit on the 20 years we're talking about. So first of all, you don't see much difference between the 2010 to 2010, 2000 to 2020, and the last 10 years. We have more or less the same situation with some ups and downs. Let's see the main differences. This is a nice graph made recently by Giampiero Romana, a very important agronomist in Barolo region. So here you have the heat, the rain, The harvest time is the red line, and the thin dotted line is the average of harvest time. So here you can see we have some ups and downs that were due to not only heat or cold, but to a combination of heat and rain. So let's analyze briefly what this data will show us. So first of all, 2003 was the first incredibly hot vintage. We'll talk about that in more details later. But it's been reached, the heat of 2003 has been reached and sometimes surpassed, many times actually, by many other vintages. Many vintages with growing degree days, so the active heat, let's call it like that, so that heat that really works on the photosynthesis and the growth, that were more than 2000 Celsius, which is a lot. And so many vintages have reached that or surpassed that. The main difference between the first and the second decades of the 21st century, in the first decade, we had heat and low amount of rainfall, especially in 2003, but also the next year, with the only exception basically of 2002. But in the last decade, many years with rainfalls that were more than 700 millimeters. Normally, we have an average of 500-600, okay? Other elements that we can see from this table, the average time of harvest is almost constant in these 20 years. We have ups and downs, but the average is quite constant. The big differences are in what we saw before. So this last 20 years compared to the previous decades. Another element, Nebbiolo. This is harvest time for Nebbiolo on this table, okay? And Nebbiolo can partially compensate these thermal extremes. It's not so much so for Barbera. So when we talk about difference in times of harvest for Nebbiolo, we're talking about a couple of weeks normally, okay? With Barbera, we can talk about 1 month. So, and sometimes in a late harvest, Barbera can overlap with Nebbiolo. Normally we harvest Barbera before, but Barbera can have a wider range of harvest time, and also other grape varieties. So Nebbiolo can compensate a little bit. But of course, these are analyses of the data of the different vintages. But Barolo is not only defined by vintage. We are talking about Barolo. So at least the 3 key factors, not only for Barolo, but in particular for Barolo. The vintage, of course, location. If there's anybody out there working in the real estate business, knows what I'm talking about. Or we can call it the NGA, or crew factor. So as you just said, as Masnaghetti reported, there is a reason if some locations are considered better than others, because in different conditions they can still give great wines. And of course, viticulture and winemaking. The choice of all the techniques in the vineyard and the winemaking process can change the tendency of a single vintage. And again, the example we just made on the 2017 with some producer giving a bit overripe and other really fresh wines can be a very good example of that. So this is a map again taken from Masnaghetti. We can never thank him enough for his enormous work on Barolo and Barbares. Okay. So this is a map of the time of harvest. So very early, intermediate, late, and very late. And we're talking from, the beginning of October up to basically mid-October. This analysis is on the average of the 2007, 2016 vintages. So it's a good report. And as you can see, there are huge differences. We have an area here where you see blue, so it's late harvest. And it's not higher than other parts of Barolo. It's simply more exposed to the Alps, which are on this side. So the cold currents in Barolo region come from the southwest, okay? And the heat comes from here. And as a matter of fact, here where the heat comes up from the valley of Barolo and the cold comes from Novello, from the southwest corner, where these two currents collide, that's the area that's normally more covered with hailstorm, where it's more possible to have hailstorms. But you can see that, even positioned with the same altitude on the sea level, with the same exposure, can have really different types of times of harvest. Let's take, this part, for example, and this same same altitude, same exposure, but hugely different times of harvest. So a vintage here is very different from a vintage here in terms of climate.
One of the things before you turn that map, go back to that on Rivera, and I've talked to several producers. Rivera over the last, let's say, decade, maybe 15 years, has become, if not a grand cru of the Barolo zone, certainly one of the most important. We have a lot of top producers like Vietti and Pablo Scavino that have purchased rows there. And of course, it's best known for the work of Walter Fisori and Elvio Cogno. And all these producers have told me that this is Rivera itself in Novello has become kind of a reference point for climate change. These cold winds coming from the Alps. This used to be a very tannic wine.
Yeah, and we are exactly here.
Yeah, and as of the last 10, 15 years or so, this shows what climate change has done as you've got warmer temperatures. The tannins are much softer now. Rivera is certainly one of the most charming wines. The Barolos from Rivera have a great amount of finesse to them. So that's an example of a short amount of history changing because of the climate.
Exactly. So remember always, when we talk about Barolo, the vintage is important. Some vintages have more bias on the wine, others have less bias on that. But of course, is the terroir, the location that always has a huge impact on that. Talking about briefly about the 14th, imagine, for example, the difference you can have between Barolo and Barbaresco. That can be even 30-50% more or less rain in the same vintage between Barolo and Barbaresco, and they're like 10 miles away. But even within the smaller zone of Barolo, there are huge differences. This is the map that Masnaghetti used to draw the borders of the crew when he did the first maps. This was the Google image that was on Google Earth some 20 years ago when he started this job. And here we can see some places where the snow is still there, and just around the corner, the snow is melted. Sometimes here in Barolo, you can walk through a little trail, and on your left side, for example, you have 10 inches of snow. On the right side, you have flowers blossoming and grass, in the same moment. That can go on for maybe a week or two. So it's a little difference in the sun exposure or exposure to the wind, and it can make a huge difference. And actually, Masnaghetti used this image of the snow to define the exact borders, which sometimes are not so obvious on the map of the different crews. And this is another image taken from Masnaghetti Barolo MGA. As you can see, the differences are really within a few rows away. The climatic conditions are hugely different. And this is, I think, an image that can show it really well, or an image from a guy called Tom Hyland. This is Arborina, and as you can see, 2 rows away, and here you still have the snow. And here it's super sunny. Or for example, in a hot year, here it's more ventilated than here, and you can have sometimes hugely different microclimatic conditions for the wines.
And for those people that don't know, Arborina is an important MGA in the commune of La Mora.
Yeah, very close to Rocca dell'Annunziata, but
Yes.
with different conditions, different times of harvest, very different from Rocca dell'Annunziata, and it's basically the next hill from Rocca. So what do you think, Tom? We can start our trip through the 2020 vintages.
Yes, why don't we get started?
I can talk more. I will just talk about the climatic conditions. So I will start from winter to the harvest time, and you will go on from harvest time to the final result of the wine, and then the evolution of the wine. So we start with a great vintage, 2000. We had a mild winter with little snow, and then a very wet spring that put up some more water in the soil that prevented from stress in the summer. We had a long sunny summer with very stable condition, then some variable weather from mid-September. So basically, but most of the sugar ripening was done. We slowed down with the polyphenolic ripening, which is sometimes really good for Nebbiolo. But then the final part, again, thanks to the fact that Nebbiolo, remember that it's the first grape variety that starts to blossom in the spring, and the last that we harvest. So it's the one that's more exposed to the climate condition. So during harvest time, the conditions were dry and warm, so we had very, very healthy grapes. They were high in sugar with deep color, thanks to these ups and downs of temperature in September. Full and complex aromas with excellent structure and rich in polyphenols. So both things, sugar on one side, but richness of tannins, etc. Thanks to this hot summer and then the cooler temperatures in September. So this is what happened at the harvest time. What about the wines, Tom?
The wines, we can't spend as much time with each vintage as we would like to.
Of course.
2000 is an important reference point because there were some tremendous reviews for these wines when they were first released. As you pointed out, with this weather, it was very warm, and the wines themselves were forward. The tannins were very round and very soft. These wines were much more approachable than wines, from recent vintages. Now, as you pointed out in your original chart, climate change may have started, and there's no one exact year. There's all sorts of disagreements on this, but certainly 1990 was another reference point. And I don't want to compare 90 and 2000 because 1990, the wines to me are much more complex and much more intense, much more full-bodied, have longer aging potential. But 2000 was interesting because it got some tremendous reviews, more from critics outside Italy than from the Italian critics. And I talked to several producers about that when these wines were coming out. They had just released their 1999s, which is an outstanding vintage, very powerful wines, beautiful acidity. Everything was just great about those wines. And so they had just released 1999. They were about to release a year later, the 2001s, which was an equally outstanding vintage, maybe just a touch lighter than 99, but gorgeous wines, again, just classic vintage. And here they had 2000, which were forward and were approachable and were soft, were not as complex as 99 or 2001. And the producers thought, how are we going to sell these wines? We've got it, it's a nice vintage, but nothing like 99 or 2001. And sure enough, these reviews came along, and it grabbed a lot of attention. Now, it's easy to look back and say, well, it was, these great superlatives about the vintage were a little bit too much, but the wines are very well balanced. And surprisingly, some of them, maybe not so surprisingly, one of the things we have to remember about, again, as you said before, Barolo is Barolo. We're not looking at any other wine here. These things do change over the years, and many of the wines are still drinking very well. Now, some of them have reached peak. We are looking at 20, 21 years now. So, not every vintage can make a super powerful wine, but some of them have reached peak and some of them are a little bit tired. But there are others that have aged very well. And just as an example, Pio Cesare is just now releasing a 2000 Reserva. And if the wines of Pio Cesare, that the wine has to be something very, very special. So it's a vintage that it was an early harvest. I'd like to call it an average to maybe slightly above average vintage. So some, elegant wines, maybe some of those critics outside of Italy, some of them were from America. I mean, I'm from America too. I'm not trying to distance myself here, but I wasn't doing that many reviews back then. But you could probably call it an American vintage. I don't want to use the term international vintage.
More, call it American or international, but I mean, for sure, softer, more approachable. Exactly. That's for sure. Something similar happened in between 96 and 97, where 97 was so celebrated that it overshadowed the 96. And a few years later, the 96 started to show better sometimes than the 97. Barolo is, as we were saying before, compared to other grape varieties, Nebbiolo, and then Barolo tend to be a little bit more unpredictable, a little bit like Pinot Noir sometimes. So there are some vintages that start in a certain way and then they change, or some others start to be like that from the very beginning and they're the same after 20 years. So it's not so predictable. So that maybe is what is fascinating sometimes about Barolo. And then the 2001, we start with different conditions, completely different. Wet winter and that warm beginning of spring. So we had early budding, but then we had frosty in April. It happened again in 2017 in different conditions. Fall, cold, freezing cold, and then followed by huge hailstorms, which are very uncommon in April. We normally have them in July, August. So very, very strange conditions. Then we had hot and rainy May, which pushed the vegetative part of the plants a lot. And of course, with all this water, no water stress in the summer. We had some big hailstorms again in mid-September and cooler temperatures. So for those who had some damages from the hailstorms, had suffered a lot, but others, thanks to these cooler temperatures, enjoyed a very, very regular polyphenolic ripening, very gradual and almost perfect. So we have good alcohol, deep color, ample complex bouquet in the grapes and then in the wines, good structure and plenty of polyphenols. Okay, you can go on with wines.
There's not much I can add to that, Sandro. You summed it up very well. I consider this to be an outstanding vintage. That's my high point, a 5-star vintage, if you will. Wines have great structure to them, beautiful acidity. In terms of power, I mean, it's all about balance and harmony. So it's not the most powerful vintage. When we get to 2006, we'll talk about that. But very, very big wines and great aging potential. The wines are drinking incredible right now. So all positives in this vintage.
Then 2002, very. I think it's a good example of how sometimes it's not a bad vintage; it's a hard vintage, and it doesn't mean that if it's a hard vintage, it doesn't mean that the wines are necessarily bad. Of course, we had very critical conditions. It will always be remembered, like 2014, for the abundant spring and summer rains, culminating in a dreadful hailstorms, one but very big in Barolo zone. So we had half production in Barolo, a bit less because in Barbaresco we tend to have less hailstorms due to different climatic conditions, but still a good big reduction in the production. Of course, in areas which were not touched by hail, thanks to the late ripening of Nebbiolo, we can find Barolo with great color intensity, fruit and body, supported by intense, lively tannins. For example, some parts of the upper part of Serralunga and other parts, those who survived the hailstorm, then they enjoyed an almost perfect end of September and October. So in 2002, we really had to work hard in the vineyards. We had to discard a huge quantity of grapes that were attacked by mold because of the humidity. But still, we can have some incredible examples of Barolo that I have a few of them in my cellar that I think still, they can still be there for maybe another year. On the 20 years, I will start to check some of them.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have any in my cellar. I've only had a few of these when they first came out. And, the word was that this was going to be a terrible vintage. And again, much of this had to do with the fact that the hailstorms, as you mentioned, a good part of Lamora was wiped out. And since Lamora has the most MGA, along with Serralunga, that's what people remember. They don't remember the small communes, they remember the big communes. So as you mentioned, that one of the higher spots in Barolo is Verduno. And Verduno was not touched by hail that year. So again, I haven't had these wines in years, but apparently these are some of the finest Barolos from 2002. Wines from Verduno. So Monvigliero is the most famous MGA from that commune. So,
and also Francia, Francia, where they make the Monfortino, was not touched by hail. And I have a nice Monfortino, 2002. Would love to share with you when you can travel again.
That would be great. Okay.
So after 2002, we have those who started winemaking. I know a few people that started their winery in 2002. It was really hard. First a terrible year like that, and then an incredibly different year, 2003. The first really hot and dry vintage that was paralleled only in 2017 for now. So the vintage started out with 2 weeks later than average until May, let's say. Then lasting sunny condition and almost no rainfall for about 5 months. Temperatures were to historic maximums over 40 Celsius, 100 and something Fahrenheit. Active temperatures, we had an aggregate of 1,740 Celsius. Imagine that the hot vintage that was considered until then 1997 summed up 1400s. And then, the same period the year before, we had less than 1400. So imagine that these are the active temperatures, the ones that are really giving the energy for the photosynthesis. Rainfall, very little, 265, sorry. Normally we had around 500, okay? And you can see, the year before we had like 3-4 times more.
Yeah,
Some bunches.
Sandro, if I can translate that into inches, that would be in 2003, that works out to 12 inches of rain compared to 40 inches of rain in 2002.
Exactly.
So a huge difference in those 2 years.
Huge difference in 2 years. That year, some bunches were clearly being scorched by the sun. Also, the canopy management was not exactly what we are doing now, which is more accurate now. One of the earliest harvests ever recorded, the first that was so early, and then again paralleled only in 2017. So the wines here are the grapes were full of sugar, so the wines were plenty of alcohol with very low acidity. Would you like to add something more about the 2003 wines?
Not too much. The earliest harvest, we're looking at September 25th. This was when most harvest started for Nebbiolo, for Barolo. And if you go back, it's in the not too distant past, the 1960s and 70s, we're looking at the middle of October, even late October, and in certain cold years, even the first week of November, first few days of November. So at this point, this September 25th was just something that no one had seen at that point.
Exactly.
No one could imagine you would harvest Nebbiolo that early. So
Exactly.
I only had a few of these wines, and they came out. That's a long time ago. I haven't had any since. I don't know, how they're holding up. I have to plead ignorance in this. I don't know if you have any left in your cellar, but
No.
these are certainly wines that are going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to find anymore. So
Sure.
you don't mean to dismiss the vintage, but if there's one to kind of, just glance over real quickly, 2003 would be the one.
Yeah. And also, again, as you said, the vintners didn't have any benchmark with that, so it was hard to guess what to do, in a year like that.
Good point.
Then, fortunately, after two difficult, very different, and both very difficult, again, because we didn't have any reference to those to the climatic conditions, then we had 2004, which was a bit more classic in a way. So cold, snowy winter, followed by a spring with plenty of rain until beginning of May. So there were some worries for the powdery mildew, but then the vintage follow a normal pattern, climatic pattern. So not overly hot summer, but hot enough, appropriate amount of rain. September and early October, we had sunshine, no rainfall. Temperatures were a little bit above seasonal average. So we had a very long harvest this year. So it lasted for more than usual. Normally it's squeezed in a week, 10 days. Here we had a bit more. So the grapes you could decide to pick the grapes when you thought they were ready. You were not hurried to pick them before the rain or something like that. So it was kind of an easy vintage, if you want. So harvest with no worries and really, really excellent quality on all aspects of the grapes.
Several things I can comment on 2004, and we'll take a little more time with this vintage because, in my opinion, this is one of the 5 best vintages of the millennium. Sometimes it's like, let's talk about the last 2 or 3 vintages, and 2004 was not that long ago, but those wines have been purchased and those wines are gone, but those wines are just gorgeous. Not only, as you said, a wonderful normal year, and the wines have excellent acidity, beautiful structure. It was an easy year for the growers. The wines are among the most harmonious of any in the entire millennium. And one of the things I found when I tried these wines, when I went to a preview tasting in Alba, is that these are among the most floral of all the Barolos of the 21st century, and they may still be. I would only rate 1 or 2 other vintages as being as floral with this, and we don't think about that sometimes. Sometimes we just think about, we're so used to these descriptions in publications about the black fruits and the red fruits and everything else, and we don't think about the flowers too much. But that adds to the charm and elegance, and it can only be, we can never say it enough about how feminine a wine Barolo is, as powerful as it is, as big as the tannins are. Barolo's charm to me is always the fact that it does have finesse to it, that it does have these round, elegant tannins to them. Some years, more than others, but
More than ours.
and as I said, I think it's one of the most harmonious vintages of all of the wines. And one of the things, I was invited to do a tasting at a restaurant in New York back in 2016, and we did, I think it was 2016, but we did the 2004 vintage. We did about 10 different wines, and these wines had not changed. Sandro, you brought this up before, that some vintages change a little bit more than others, some just a few years, some it takes a long time. These vintages, these 2004s were as charming and as floral and as elegant 12 years later as they were when they were first bottled, first released. So that's one of the great things I like about Barolo. Other people like a little more power in their wines. These are plenty big wines. I remember talking to a producer when we tasted these wines at the event in Alba, and I said, these wines have 20, 25 years on them, right? He said maybe 30 or 35. So there's no hurry to drink the 2004s if you've stored them properly. So this is a real benchmark for me, a great, great vintage in every aspect, not only cellar potential, but also finesse and charm and harmony.
Yeah. And in my experience, cellar potential is not linked to the tannins or the acidity or the alcohol. It's linked to the equilibrium, to the balance of wine. Exactly. And harmonious wine, an harmonious Barolo will be a Barolo with a great aging potential.
Exactly.
More than anything, more than it's the mix of parameters, the balance of that gives the great aging potential. So sometimes it's true. Sometimes people say, oh, we know a Barolo with a long aging potential must be a little hard when young. Not necessarily so. When it's perfectly balanced when young, it's also after 20 years.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's go to the 2005 again. In my opinion, what you think about that, Tom? A little bit like we said before, a great vintage. Sometimes you have the next one or the previous one are sometimes overshadowed a little bit. I think this is the example also for 2005 compared to 2004. So maybe less celebrated sometimes, but I think also very interesting vintage. So we had a mild winter with little snow, cold but dry spring, so not a lot of water reserve in the soil. Very hot in July, but the rest of, so we had some worries about the stress, but the rest of the summer was dry but fresher than usual. The rain in middle of the Barolo harvest was early October, kind of divided the vintage in two, those who harvested before or after the rain. So this is a good example of how 30, 40 years ago, without the forecast that we have today, when everybody would have picked before the rain, okay? But sometimes the wines picked before the rain are not so perfectly ripened. Those who picked after the rain, sometimes just after the rain, they were too kind of rich in water, in the berries. But then after a few days, it dried up. So there was a more perfect ripening. So the vintage can be divided more than in terms of terroir, sometimes in terms of when it was harvested, before or after that particular rain. We have lower yields than usual here in 2005. The wines tend to be high in sugar, acidity in the north, but excellent phenological structure, especially those that were harvested after the rain.
Yes, your point about the rain, the growers picking some before, some after. Masnaghetti makes that comment in his book as well, and I just want to, repeat our thanks to Alessandro for this. We both contacted him and asked for permission to use, graphs and photos and some of his comments from his book. So we thank Alessandro for that, as well as his body of work over the last 2 decades. I haven't had many of these wines lately, but my notes when I had them was that they were going to age very well. They're not powerful wines at all. They're not as complex as 2004, but they do have that charm. They do have that finesse, and the best wines are nearing peak. So we're talking about 15, 16 years now. So, which is not that long for Barolo, but this is a very underrated vintage. And if you see any 2005s out there, I think depending on the producer and the MGA, I think it's a very good bet.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's time to drink them, and they can give very great satisfaction. 2006, we had a perfect balance between rain in the spring and dry, hot summer. So enough water reserve, and then the heat in the summer. There were heat waves in July, then it cooled down in August with big differences between day and night. And we all know that, especially for Nebbiolo, this is really, really good for the perfumes, for the polyphenols in general, but specifically for the perfumes of Nebbiolo. There was a big rain in mid-September, like 4 days, but the soils were quite dry after this quite hot and dry summer, so they absorb the water without problem. So we didn't have worries for the harvest time. Then again, low night temperatures by the end of the ripening season that gave a great concentration of aromas. So relatively warm in the day, but really cold at night. Perfect conditions. The wines are so concentrated, rich in red fruits, firm but well integrated tannins, and when it came out, it was promising a very good aging potential. Do you think the premises of the first indication of a good aging potential were confirmed after a few years?
I do agree on that. A note on the cooler temperatures in August, according to the statistics that Masnaghetti put in his book, this was the coolest August in the entire decade, with the exception of 2002. We know that was a challenging vintage, but things turned out great in 2006, after 2004, and then the lighter style 2005. This was a huge difference. This was a powerful vintage. The wines are incredibly powerful, and they have great aging potential. And of course, again, it's not just because that they're big wines. It's the total balance and everything. But it's the question is, when are these wines going to come around? They have at least another decade, the best examples, and maybe even as much as 20 years. This is, if you're looking at older vintages to pick up and put in your cellar, this is one of the key vintages. 2006 wines will age for a long, long time. Maybe they're not the most charming wines. I think you could say that easily, but again, it depends on what you're looking for. But if you're looking for aging potential and power and complexity, 2006 is an outstanding example of those characteristics in Barolo.
Yeah, kind of a benchmark for that.
Exactly.
Then 2007, that we can consider overall hot vintage, not extremely hot, but surely a hot vintage. The year began with unusually hot and dry winter. Then we had little rainfall, but just at the right times, a good amount. So no worries about powdery mildew or other problems, fungi in general. Summer temperatures were high, but with good ventilation. So we didn't really have heat waves here. We had some hailstorms in June, but in June the hailstorm don't compromise the quality. They can reduce a little bit the quantity, but it's still before the green harvest, so they didn't really make a difference in that. End of the summer was less hot, cool nights that allowed a good ripening. In 2007, we had really, really healthy grapes, no molds attack at all during harvest time, with a slightly lower yields, also because of that hailstorms, but also for the heat in the summer. So it was altogether an early harvest with quite high sugar, body and structure, and powerful fruity side of the wine, like very ripened fruit.
Yes, those cool nights you pointed out were very helpful to these wines, because there was the thought of, or the fear maybe, of another 2003 of being
exactly
hot. And it didn't turn out that way. The wines are much more elegant now. They don't have, I found that a lot of the 2007s do not have the structure and the persistence of the best vintages like 2004 or 6 or 2001. But they're very elegant wines. Just quickly, we don't want to spend too much time on this, but I know when I first, started tasting Barolo in great detail, when I started to go to Alba and go to the Langhe, I was still, kind of somebody who was comfortable with California wines, and obviously the weather and the grapes and everything else, it's totally different. So I had sort of a California palate. It took me a while to kind of get used to this. to Barolo, and now I have an Italian palate, or a Piemontese palate, if you will.
Absolutely.
And 2007 was one that stood out to me as like not one of my favorites, because it was, if we can use the term an international vintage, this is the one that you would say was like that. And you certainly had, there's nothing wrong with that, because in the sense you had a lot of attention for Barolo from all around the world, not just American critics, but critics from Hong Kong and from Japan and from Russia and other countries as well. So this 2007, while it may not be the most classic Piemontese vintage, it's another reference point for vintage where they made very elegant, charming wines. And many of these are still in very, very good shape. So it's it may not be the most, you know, Piemontese structured vintage, but the wines are very elegant, very flavorful, and have excellent varietal character to them.
Absolutely. Talking about your palate, Tom, I know you're a fan of Grignolino, and that makes you a very Piedmontese palate.
Okay, all
for
right.
sure.
All right.
So after that, 2008, a bit more classic situation. The year began with good climatic trend in the spring, so very regular bud break and flowering. Long period of stability towards the end of the summer with mild days and cool nights. Again, great aromas. Then we had 2 cold weeks in September during the last phases of ripening that gave lots of freshness to wines that need maybe some time to round up, but with the freshness that puts them in the classic vintage scheme. Okay, an excellent harvest for all varieties, not only for Nebbiolo and Barolo, quite classic harmonious. We had some fruit set difficulties with Hayston that led to harvest that was slightly smaller than 2007, but with no real concern about that. So let's call it. Can we call it a classic Barolo vintage in your opinion?
We definitely can. It's a classic Piemontese, classic Barolo vintage, and the differences between 2007, the year before, and 2008 are like night and day. People that were just starting to be introduced to Barolo and love the 2007s, they probably were a little puzzled by all the reaction in 2008. But if you're somebody that has a lot of history tasting Barolo, you would love these wines. They have beautiful structure to them. They don't jump, it doesn't jump out of the glass at you. Now, the wines were not backwards like the wines from 40 years ago, but these wines that are a little mysterious, they reveal themselves over time, and they really change over time. And the structure of these wines have given them the potential for great aging in your cellar. These are, starting to, become teenagers now, if you will, and have a lot of life ahead of them. It's a great vintage. And maybe that some people might not agree, but it's certainly not as powerful a vintage as some years. But in terms of harmony, 2008 is as good as anything.
Yep. Then we go to 2009, in which we had winter with heavy snowfalls. I remember that I was living in Monforte, and one night we were using bobsleigh from the top of Monforte to the square on the bottom of the village. Yeah, the next day the pharmacist was very happy because everybody was buying things for bruises and that, because we had a black the electricity went away, blackout, and we had the snow, and so everybody was going blind through the village in the snow. So anyway, winter with heavy snowfalls, rainy spring, so excellent soil water reserves. The reserves proved to be absolutely vital for a summer, which was almost hot and dry, to almost total lack of rain, and intense heat that was especially in the second part of the summer, when it starts to become really crucial. Weather so was irregular pattern, very dependent on the area. Again, it's one of these vintages where the location becomes again very, very important. Given very irregular ripening of the grapes, also the different qualities. The best producer in this year performed a harvest that was not only vineyard by vineyard, but was almost row by row. So even within a small vineyard in a small MGA or cru, we had to maybe do different phases in the harvest. So it was absolutely important here to determine the location and the right moment for each plot of land in the Barolo district.
Just very
What about
briefly,
wines?
just very briefly, I like your description of row by row, because it just shows you that in any vintage, no matter how good or how bad, the wines are going to be different. I will admit to this not being one of my favorite vintages. When I tasted them early on, I thought they had green tannins to them. They were not the most elegant wines I'd had from Barolo. And yet recently I had a Cerrequio from a very fine producer that I had this earlier this year. So at 11 years old, it was incredibly elegant. So it all depends on when you picked, and again, the best vintages produce the best wines every year. So the wines, to me, most of them are nearing peak. I would not lay these wines away for too long. I'm a little bit disappointed by this vintage, but some of you watching today, may think differently about 2009, and maybe one of your favorites, but they definitely do not have the acidity that I like in the best vintages.
Yeah, I also agree that it's one of those vintages where you can hear very different opinions on the wines, depending on which Barolo wine has tried and tasted. Then 2010, it's considered again a great vintage. We had heavy snowfalls in the winter, so we had good water reserve. Mild spring, we had very vigorous bud break. Beginning of the summer, we had plenty of rainfall, times very heavy rainfall, and some light localized hailstorms. So again, in beginning of the summer, they don't really harm too much. Mild temperatures in August led to kind of late old time, you can call it old time style harvest, and not only for Nebbiolo, but for all grape varietals. We had excellent variations between day and night temperatures, especially in September. So again, grapes with great phenolic structure, great perfumes. This is again an example of a year that rewarded the great cruise. Also, again, what the Masnaghetti said, the best locations are always the best, even in different vintages. So elegant and balanced wines with lots of red fruits and good acidity from the right location. And again, when we did the harvest, we understood that this could be a wine with good aging potential. Do you confirm this preview?
Very much, very much. An outstanding vintage without question, and one of the top 5 for me in the whole millennium. Your point about reward of the great cruise, this is one of those vintages where winemakers told me the wines from Serralunga taste like they're from Serralunga. The wines from La Mora taste like they're from La Mora.
Exactly.
I'm picking those two up because they're very different in style. In a general way of speaking, it all depends on the human element. It depends on the individual soils in each vineyard. But in hot vintages, some of the wines start to taste alike. And these were moderate temperatures, which helped that. So the wines are not only beautifully balanced and harmonious and have a good amount of floral, perfumes to them, but they are the most expressive of their site. These are wines that really represent their sense of origin. These are wines that the Piemontese like to say have anima, they have soul.
Yeah.
So and these are wines that will age another 15, 20 years without question.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's one of the best vintages if you want to organize a horizontal tasting to taste the different styles and different subzones, crus. It's one of the best that you can use. And so from a vintage that was very expressive of the location, a vintage that has put its bias of the vintage a bit stronger on the vines, on the vines, of course, and then on the wines. So kind of unconventional with very early harvest and low yields, 2011, strongly fluctuating weather conditions. So not just hot altogether, but very fluctuating, very challenging vintage, in my opinion. Choosing the best practices, the best canopy management, the best way of trimming or leaving more or less leaves around the bunches was crucial this year. And of course, again, the right soil and climate. Some varieties, so other Barbera and other great wines, others suffer depending also on the time of harvest. Nebbiolo, of all these varieties, was the one that adapted best to this changing condition. Again, as we said at the very beginning, it's a great variety that can compensate somehow, not to the extreme, but compensate more than others. So with low yields, excellent amount of tannins and good color, great aromatic profile, but still the powerful wines given by this heat waves that we experienced in the summer. The harvest time was performed in very dry and hot conditions, so the grapes were absolutely healthy and they didn't didn't need many treatments. What about the wines?
This is one of those vintages where you can have, you know, the box on the left with the pros and the box on the right with the cons.
Right.
They're very pretty wines. First of all, you're following 2010, so let's talk about a difficult act to follow. It was very hot in 2011, and it was an early harvest, like September 28th. We're talking about many producers started their harvest, so they do not have the acidity that the best vintages had, 2008, 2010, for example. And yet these are very enjoyable wines. They have excellent varietal character to them. The problem I had with the wines, besides not having the acidity of the structure for long-term potential aging,
Absolutely.
is that they didn't have the persistence that you find in the best vintages. So I've recently had some reservas from 2011 that are showing very well. And it's a difficult vintage to pigeonhole. So a lot of good things about it and a lot of not so great things about it. But overall, it's an average vintage. Maybe some of you might like it a little bit better than that. But you know, it's kind of in the middle for me.
Mm-hmm. Now let's go to 2012. I can't wait because I have 2012 in my glass that I want to taste now. And it's one of my personal favorite vintages. We had a kind of fluctuating climate trend with not regular, unusually cold winter, very dry and warm in the summer. In early September, we had rainfalls that gave some worries for the harvest time, but then we had a great autumn again that was crucial to keep perfect ripening, especially again for Nebbiolo, which we harvest a bit later. Again, big variation in day and night temperatures led to great phenolic structures. The fruit of 2012 has freshness, more than full body, and a vintage of great balance, and I think of varietal purity. So when we want to understand the varietal here, it's, in my opinion, one of the best vintages, and probably this is why it's one of my favorite till now. What do you think, Tom?
We're in total agreement.
Meanwhile, I'll taste the 2012.
Please, yeah, enjoy. We're in total agreement on this vintage. I could kind of think of 2010, but a lighter vintage than 2010. And I say that because it has all of the components you want. The wines just aren't powerful, but they are among the prettiest, the most charming, the most harmonious wines. Again, this was a vintage that, because it wasn't extraordinarily hot, you got good sense of terroir. The wines from Castiglione Falletto stood out. The wines from Lamora stood out. The wines from Cervello from many places stood out. Beautifully balanced. They're in great shape. This is an underrated vintage. Some people kind of pass this over, but we're in agreement on this. Great varietal purity to them, and great elegance and beautiful acidity. Yeah. So a vintage that, because it's not as powerful as some, doesn't get the plaudits it deserves.
Exactly. Here I have the room is filled with the aromas of this wine. You have dark fruit here. You have the fruitiness is still very evident here. You really feel like you're tasting the fruit of Nebbiolo here. And also, this is a Canubi. You can clearly feel that you can call it balsamic or eucalyptus note that is kind of typical in the Canubi. We start to have some tertiary aromas that are absolutely underlining the wine, but is still kind of through forward. The tannins are absolutely smooth, compact, and absolutely ripen and sweet. Remember that the ripening of tannins, 80% of that happens in the polymerization happens on the vines when the bunches are still attached on the vines. So it's not a matter of the aging here; it's a matter of a very, very well balanced vintage. So enough trumpets for the 2012. Let's go to another more classic vintage, 2013. We had a cool relatively cool vintage, normal in the winter, but particularly wet in the spring. So that delayed at the start of the growing season. We were somehow concerned a little bit in the beginning. But then we had a perfect climate in summer and autumn, warm and dry, but with a relatively good, fairly good water reserve in the ground, especially in the ground that has a bit more clay. Nebbiolo benefit the most for being the late harvest grape variety. We had a generous harvest in terms of quantity. Operation here could be, again, as we said before, for other vintages, could be delayed without problems. So you can wait 1 or 2 days more to have the perfect ripening without worries for the weather. So quality grapes, very, very healthy with good acidity, intense aromatic with fresh and powerful, and potentially with a long life ahead. What do you think?
Confermo 100%, 100% agreement with you. I remember tasting these wines in 2017 when they came out, and I'm writing down notes like 25 years, maybe 25 years plus. And I thought, given my age, I might not be around in 25 years. So start to drink some of these, but a gorgeous finish. And your last statement there is, I agree with. Intense aromatic wines, fresh, powerful, a long life ahead of them. The best of these will be drinking well, for another 20, 25 years without a problem. So big, powerful vintage, but structure. If you want to pick up a Barolo vintage that shows structure in these wines, this is like 2013 is the year.
Yeah, great aging potential, absolutely.
Let's go to 14.
14, so after a series of hot or classic vintage, we go to something, again, very, very unusual, to say the least. Somehow comparable to 2002 that we said before. So we had a warm, snowless winter. So we were thinking we were starting a dry year again, very early start of the season because of that. Bad weather marked most of the spring and summer, causing a delay in the phenolic development and hard work in the vineyards. And also when you're working in the vineyards with lots of clay and silt, it's really, really hard when it's muddy. So then on top of that, we had 7-8 times hailstorms that reduced the production. Autumn, so what this is a weather improvement with the vineyards expertise. We had very great grapes in the best exposure, but in some places producers decided not even to make Barolo that year, to declassify to, for example, Langhe and Nebbiolo. So again, a year where the location was absolutely crucial, but also an year where you could tell where the vintners worked well and were keeping their nerves during the very rainy summer, and some of them obtained very, very great result. Just to give you an idea, normally in July we had 2, maybe 3 days of rain. That year we had 22 days of rain, and again something like that in August. I remember the only week without rain that I got that summer was when I went for a week in London. In London, no rain at all. When I came back from London, right from the airport in Turin, pouring rain for a week in a row. So very, very incredible summertime. But then again, the Nebbiolo was saved by being a late harvest grape. The second part was absolutely different and perfect. And again, I just said that before when comparing the different zones. Remember that when we talk about 14, one thing is Barolo, one thing is Barbaresco, so different vintages. Of course, not a hot vintage in Barbaresco either, but an average of 30% less rain in Barbaresco. When I say 30% on average, I mean that also that between the driest part of Barbaresco that year and the wettest part of Barolo, the difference was 60%. So it's like talking about 2 totally different vintages in that term. So again, a vintage that is for sure not considered one of the best in general, but if you find the right spot, the right producer in that year, you can have some excellent wines.
Yeah, I agree on this, and I've been a big promoter of this vintage since day one. I know a lot of people were surprised to hear me say that this is an excellent vintage, but it really is, because we have to kind of watch our time here. We don't want to go, for 10 minutes in each vintage or the remaining ones we have. But want to give them their due process. But several producers told me 2014, it kind of reminded them of what their fathers or grandfathers, how they made wine back in the 1960s and 70s, that these wines were a little bit shy, they needed time to come around. Beautiful structure. This is a classic Piemontese vintage. And as one producer told me, Nebbiolo likes cool climate. You know, there's been such a discussion lately of climate change. And certainly when 2014 came around, the term global warming was not used that year. I can tell you that. So we refer to it as climate change these days, but it was a very cool vintage. There are some wines that were not, you know, very pronounced with complexity, and they were made into Langhe and Nebbiolo. The producers thought they were not representative of their style, but some terrific, beautifully long structured wines here. Not the most powerful vintage in the world. It's not like 2013, which we just came off of, but again, a classic Piemontese vintage.
Absolutely. Yeah. Then 2015, we are getting close to the most recent vintages. We had a winter with plenty of snow, with good water supply, mild spring that brought forward the cycle a little bit. Summer, we had no rains and temperatures well above 30 Celsius, just peaked at over 40 Celsius, which is what, 105 Fahrenheit, something like that.
Around that, right?
Vineyards were not stressed anyway, because we had this amount of water supply in the ground, especially in where we have a bit more clay. Particular attention had to be paid to the canopy management that year. So leaving some leaves that would protect the bunches from direct sunlight, especially the one that comes in the middle of the day. So a lot of attention also to do the canopy management related to the orientation of each single row. Again, Barolo is a matter of row by row work. You cannot generalize, not even for a single crew. Climate in the second part of the summer allowed for an impressive accumulation of polyphenols. So we had this heat before, and then cooling down and ups and downs of temperatures that gave this final balance to the polyphenols. So quality tannins with long-lasting wines, good structure, powerful for people who like strong tannins. This is, I think, a good example. I tasted. You remember that year we had Nebbiolo Prima. We had some tastings that were did very early that year. So I mean, the year that the 2015 right. came out, and some wines were still a bit hard, to taste because of the very strong tannins. Then what happened if you tasted, and you're tasting recently now 2015. So tell me more about this vintage.
This is a classic example of why you should not listen to the early soundbite.
Yeah.
Soundbite shouldn't be used to describe any wines of, wines, red wines that have aging potential, or white wines, but especially with Barolo. If there's one wine you shouldn't use soundbites on, and 15 was that. I remember a few years before, maybe in like 14 or 15, excuse me, 16 or 17, before the wines were released. Producers, I asked them what, how the 15 Barolo is going to be, and they said, well, it's 15 is going to be a nice year for Barbera, meaning that it was very hot, and that Barbera, of course, can withstand the heat because there's so much natural acidity for them, and that Barolo might not show too well. Nebbiolo for any wine might not show too well, and yet the wines have shown very well. It's lighter than 13, it's lighter than 16, which we'll talk about in a second, but beautiful wines, beautifully balanced. Again, they show their sense of origin very well. I've just recently, the 2015 Reserva Barolos have just been released. I've tried them from about a dozen producers, and they're gorgeous wines, and they'll age a long time. I think these 15 Reservas will age a good 15 to 20 years. So an excellent vintage.
Yep, I totally agree. Then 2016, if there is the perfect wave for the surfers, there is also sometimes a perfect vintage for winemakers. And if that happens, the 2016 would be one of them. So extraordinary vintage will be talked about for a long time. Certainly one of the longest lasting vintages in recent years, meaning that the time of harvest was very wide, made without worries. You could choose the time window that you prefer for your vineyard very easily. The vegetative cycle started early, but then the late cold of the following period led to a delay. So in the end, we had again the phenological phases that were spread over the entire year almost. Then the development again was accelerated in August and September. Second half of September, crucial for the positive development of the structure of the wines of the polyphenols. So wines with excellent balance, big bouquet, great structure, and not just for Barolo and Nebbiolo and Barolo. So it's a vintage that was absolutely perfect for the white grape varieties up to the Nebbiolo. So one of the vintages, as we said before, that are somehow easier. It's easier to make great wines in vintages like this. And so it's one of those years where you basically can't go wrong with MGA or a producer. The level is absolutely outstanding for almost everybody. What do you think, Tom?
I agree, and extraordinary is, I don't usually use that in my descriptions, but I can't disagree with that. It's a remarkable vintage. It's clearly one of the 3 or 4 best of the millennium. And the amazing thing about this is not only their freshness and the aromatics, the perfumes, but also how approachable these wines are. And certainly,
Yep.
the 2016s are going to be in great shape in 20 or 25 years, maybe even longer, depending on the wine and the vineyard it's from. But these are wines that you could, they were not hard at all. The tannins were so refined, so well managed that it's the perfect storm, if you will. It's a great vintage. And I hit so many high scores for the 2016s, and I can't wait for the reserves to come out next year, because those should be off the chart. And if you haven't bought any 2016s yet, please go out and buy them, because most of them are gone. The word got out very early on this vintage.
Yeah.
And I said not to trust the early word sometimes, but with 2016, producers were telling me this 2-3 years before the release. It's like, wait till my 2016s come out. Gorgeous ones. Superb vintage.
I remember, just to confirm what you're saying, I remember I did many barrel tasting of that vintage. I remember the spring 2017. So you could not even call it Barolo yet, of course. I did, especially with Giacomo Fenocchio, we did some barrel tasting.
Yes.
The wine was, we were like, why don't we bottle and bring them right now? It's absolutely perfect already. So of course it got even better through the years, but it's one of those examples where the vintage is like that from the beginning. So I think again in the future we will not have any big surprises about.
Yeah, I think when we go back and look at the great vintages of the last 50 years, we talk about like 1958 and 1974 and 78, 89, 2004, 2010, 16 is right there with it. So not just one of the best vintages of the last 20 years, but of the last 50 years.
So after 16, so after a vintage that was easy anywhere within the Barolo district, again, 2017, a vintage where the location would play a big role. We had a mild winter that started an early budding. Then we had a big frost around the end of April, 25th of April, if I remember well, that led to lower yields, but no problem with qualities, of course, at this stage of the year. Nebbiolo, to be honest, were not touched a lot. Was mostly at the bottom of the valleys where normally we put, or the north side where it's a bit more wet, where we normally put white grapes or dolcetto or other things. So Nebbiolo was not really damaged by that frost, but still it reduced the yields in the end. Since late spring, a long, warm and dry period, 5 months, no rain. So very hot and dry, somehow similar in that phase to 2003. So at the end, the harvest time was very similar again to 2003. The end of August, we had finally the long-awaited rain came. End of August, early September. Temperatures dropped down to seasonal average. So the cycle was still very early, but the wines were nonetheless able to reach the full ripening also in polyphenols. So I remember in 2017, just to tell you how early the harvest was, I remember in Monforte, there's a famous producer that makes sparkling wine with Pinot Noir, and he started picking the Pinot Noir for sparkling wine on July the 31st of July. So incredibly early. Here, fresher location and clay soil gave very balanced wines, nevertheless, even in a hot vintage like this, with good acidity, complexity, and great overall harmony. We recently tasted, for example, the Rocche Costamagna, the Rocche dell'Annunziata. They have a vineyard that's on top of the Rocche dell'Annunziata, so a bit more windy, so a bit more dry also, but the soil also is much more rich in clay than the bottom part of Rocche dell'Annunziata. So even in a hot and dry, extremely dry year like that, no problems with water stress. And also the choice of the producer to pick a little bit earlier gave us wines with great acidity, great freshness that on a blind tasting would be hard to tell they're 2017 if you taste with other 2017. Do you agree with me, Tom?
I do on a couple points. First of all, on that wine that you mentioned, the Rocche Costamagna, I did list that as one of my recommended wines from 2017 in an article I wrote last month at winesearcher.com. And it is very fresh. And other producers have told me, well, also that the higher elevation vineyards perform much better because it's cooler up there. You don't have the intense heat like you have at lower elevations. Another vintage where you just had the early word was that, well, it was incredibly hot. I was there in June. It was the hottest June ever in the Barolo zone. And I was there at the end of August, first days of September. Again, incredibly hot. I mean, I'm changing shirts a couple times a day because it's so hot. But and there are some rather disappointing wines. There are wines that have cooked fruit to them and they're not going to age that long. And then from the best producers, what I have in my glass today is the Rocche di Castiglione from Poderio d'Ero. We all know how great her wines are. You would not even think this is from a hot year. So they pick a little earlier, and they have many ways. They, in terms of maceration, in terms of extraction, it didn't extract as much. So the wines are lighter. The best wines are lighter. They're not going to age for a long time. I mean, 10, 12 years, but they're very pretty wines. And I imagine there will be a number of restaurateurs that once business starts to get going again, they'll buy a number of these wines because they're ready to drink.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So again, this is a good example on how, again, location for Barolo, and location and the producer. Of course, the choices that you make through all the whole year, and then the winemaking, of course, are absolutely crucial to obtain this balance. So this is the last vintage on sale, the last release. So let's say something briefly, of course, because we don't have the wines yet, about the last three vintages. So some notes about the climate. We cannot say much about the wines, but something on the climate for sure. 2018, which will be released in 2022, of course. Long winter with plenty of rainfall that restore the water supply from the previous very dry year, 2017. This extended until March. I remember that year people were saying, when the hell the winter is ending? It's still winter in March. Spring continued with rainfall and low temperatures. So the bud break started late. It created some difficulties also in June that was marked by many storms. So we had to work a lot with treatments that part of the year. But then we had a nice summer with a long period of constant fine weather. So two different vintages. The first part wet and cold, and then hot, fine and dry. But wines are not too high in alcohol because of that great green production in the first part, with good levels of acidity that will support the aromas. Nebbiolo here, we're ready for harvest in early October, which makes it almost a classic year in terms of times of harvest. The yields were limited because of the abnormal heat, not because of the 18, but because of the 17. So the heat that we had in 17 when the fruit bud differentiation takes place, so early summer, it was so hot and dry in 17 that it had consequences on the 2018 in terms of quantity of production yields. The results were better than had been expected at the beginning of the year. So again, 2018 we were on the roller coaster, somehow. So the first part we were and then completely different vintage. Of course, these vintages are hard to understand especially in the vineyard. What you have to do. It's still raining, or it's changing, but is it for just a few days, or will it last until the end of the harvest? So years that are not easy to interpret for interpretation for the vineyards. What do you think, Tom? Have you ever tasted some sort of en primeur?
Yes, I did some barrel tastings, and the best comment I can make about these wines is based on the Barbaresco that have been released, and the wines are very pretty. Producers there said, we really had a very successful growing season and harvest, and the wines are not like 2016. They're not going to age that long, but they're very pretty. They're beautiful varietal character to them. So if we can use Barbaresco as a base, as the model, the 2018 Barolos I put down an excellent potential, not outstanding, not superlative, but very, very successful vintage.
Then 2019, kind of the opposite of 18. So 18 first part wet and cold, and then hot. Here it was dry in the winter, then a bit rain in the spring, and then still dry and hot in the first part of the summer. And then the second part of the summer, we had hail that did considerable damages in some areas, alternated with hot days, alternated with rain, so colder and wetter in the second part of the summer. There was this hailstorm that was very, very hard, but in a very, very limited area. There were many discussions, and I remember that year because after that hailstorm, some local newspapers said, the harvest of Barolo is going to be compromised this year for the hailstorms. Right. Yes, it was totally compromised in a few hectares around the Fontana Fredda region, and then part of the Grinsane Cavour. Unfortunately, those producers suffered a total loss of the harvest that year. I passed just the day after, and I think you were there too.
Yeah, I have a picture of the hail damage if you want to take your thing down. I'll show it to people.
Yeah, if you can show them from here. I didn't put it in the presentation, but it could be a good example. The vines were like naked, completely naked.
This was actually in Sierra Lunga. You mentioned Fontana Fredda. We don't want to single them out, but you can see
that part of
the
Sierra Lunga. Yeah. And if you passed a couple of days later, it looked like winter time vines, completely
this was about the 16th or the 18th of September, I remember. So very, very late in the season.
Yeah. So again, let's go on. Back on the page 19. So as we were saying, these hailstorms, but very, very localized. Then in the second half of October, the parameters were a bit more classic. So good sugar levels, good polyphenols profile in the grapes with structure, good aging potential, high in anthocyanics. So wines with excellent color. So two opposite vintages, 18 and 19. Wet and cold before, and then hot and dry, and then the opposite in 2019. Have you tasted any?
No, just one quick comment on this, because we're running out of time here. But without tasting any barrel samples of 19, just from other varietals in the Langhe, especially Dolcetto. It might sound like a strange comparison, since Dolcetto is a relatively drink young wine, but Dolcetto has quite a bit of tannins to them, especially in the older vines. The 2019 Dolcetto are just superb, and so I base that. I don't compare Nebbiolo and Barbera because the acidity levels are so different, and the tannin levels are so different. But based on the 2019 Dolcetto, and based on all the other 2019 wines that had, be they Arnese or other grapes from the area, this has the potential to be excellent, maybe even outstanding.
So let's end with 2020. So it's somehow funny to say 2020 was a great year because we know what happened in the entire world. The year will be probably remembered more for that than for Barolo maybe, but for our region, for the grapes, it was a very good year. Winter temperatures were mild, few snowfalls. First part of the spring, dry and sunny. May and June, kind of rainy, a bit more unstable. And then the rest of the summer was perfect. Warm, no hailstorms or big weather events. We had cool overnight temperatures between the differences between day and night. So good accumulation of polyphenols. The growth was constant, very regular. Nebbiolo reached the technological maturation. So not just the sugar, but the entire maturation parameters by the end of September, early October. Early growth resulting from water supplies at the beginning of the summer allowed the vines to develop physiologically at their best, giving very, very healthy grapes. So another not only great vintage, but also in terms of treatments and work in the vineyards, we didn't have to work much. So of course, we can still not talk about the wines, but considering the data that we have for this year, we can still, we are pretty sure of saying that we can consider good to excellent, again, depending on the location, of course, but a good to excellent year. So we'll see in 2024 when the Barolo comes out, or maybe with some barrel tasting, we can give some forecast on the 2020 evolution.
Great. Sandro, I want to thank you very much for this presentation. You went above and beyond putting this together. I know it was a labor of love, so it wasn't work, but and it's something that is close to my heart. But I just felt like I was a passenger along for the ride here. So you did an outstanding job. And I want to thank everybody for staying around also. We had a good number of people a few people had to leave, understandably, after an hour, but many of you stuck around for the whole hour and a half here, and we appreciate that. So
you're
part of this, we'll have it up on YouTube very soon, and because this is a lot to grasp in an hour and a half, but you'll be able to see that soon. So
yeah, and of course on YouTube it will be there, and you can use this as a reference for the evolution of this vintage, and you can tell us when we'll meet in the future if what we said about the evolution was still true after a few years. So thanks to all of you. Thanks especially to you, Tom, for
thank you, Sandro.
This great occasion, and see you very soon here in Barolo.
Okay, fingers crossed. Okay, thanks.